panel discussion on achieving teaching excellence. I'll be introducing the speakers in just a moment, and we have some housekeeping first. Just so everyone knows, the event will be recorded, so you can watch again to relive the highlights, or tell your friends about it and share the link. It's obviously a topic that's vitally important to everyone working in further and higher education. So we're going to have some great discussion today. As people are joining, feel free to put in the chat box where you're joining from, your involvement with teaching and learning. Welcome Nehal from Leeds Beckett. And everyone can continue to use the chat box throughout. We will be having a more formal panel discussion and then open up to Q&A in the second half from the audience. So if you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat box or the Q&A box as soon as they pop into your head, and we'll be hopefully addressing them as many as possible by the end of the session. So I'm quickly going to hand over to our wonderful marketing executive, Asana, to go through our housekeeping slides.
Thank you, Laura. Can I just do a quick sound check that everybody can hear me just by raising your hand? There should be an icon with a hand that you can click on. Perfect. I see quite a few hands raised. Okay, great. So just before we begin, as Laura mentioned, I'm going to just cover off a bit of housekeeping just to make sure your experience on the webinar is as seamless as possible. So just in terms of your sound and your audio, so you're connected. If you do experience any issues with your connection, we do advise just calling in using your phone. So you can do that using the audio option at the bottom and calling in as well. Of course, if your PC is fine as well, that's okay too. Just bearing in mind with bandwidth issues, it could be someone else on your network who is using other kind of high bandwidth platforms, such as Netflix, YouTube, and gaming platforms. And if you do miss any parts of the session, as Laura mentioned, we are recording it, and we will be circulating this recording afterwards with you all as well. And there will be Q&A at the end as well. So do please use the chat box and the Q&A box that's on the side to ask any questions. So any comments you may have. We can't, unfortunately, unmute you today just because of the way the webinar is being set up. But like I said, just utilize the chat box, the Q&A, and we'll be moderating those as well just to kind of reply to you. And if any technical issues kind of come up, do just message me in the chat box as well, and I will aim to help you. Thank you. And I'll pass it back over to you, Laura.
Excellent. Thank you. So, hello, I'm Laura Pacey, head of Open University Press, and I'm delighted to now get into the main thrust of the event and introduce our speakers. I first began discussing the book project, Achieving Teaching Excellence, with Peter, Leanne, and Paul last June. So it's actually moved very quickly, and I was immediately struck by how needed this book is to respond to the demands of the TEF and highlight where there is still room for innovation. At the time, all of the authors were at Coventry University, which, as many of you will know, has been awarded the TEF Gold rating. But now, as you can see on the screen, they are all continuing their work in improving teaching and learning. But Peter Wollstonecroft is program leader for postgraduate courses at Liverpool John Moores University. Leanne Main is associate dean at De Montfort University, and Paul Cashian is institutional lead for assessment for the Coventry University group. The book itself also includes a range of case studies from various institutions to demonstrate how the research can be put into practice. So it's wonderful to have a breadth of UK institutions who are so engaged with this project and, of course, with the TEF. I'm also thrilled to introduce Barry Odonovan, who can join us today to act as our chair for today's panel discussion. Barry's Principal Lecturer of Student Experience Ops at Brookes University and has a wealth of experience working on national pedagogy projects. So I'm sure that we're in for some challenging questions and in-depth discussion today. There will also be time to answer your audience questions in the second half of the session. So as Afsana said, please do put your questions in the Q&A box and any comments in the chat box. Last but not least, it is the shameless publisher plug. So you can buy the book with a 20% discount from the McGraw Hill education website when using the discount code OPENUP20 at checkout. The entire volume is cross-referenced to both the TEF and the National Student Survey, meaning readers can easily contextualize what they have read. And if you're not convinced yet, then here is where I hand over to Barry and our wonderful authors for a deeper dive into the themes of the book and how you can achieve teaching excellence.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part in this book launch. I found the book personally very interesting and valuable, and I really appreciated a few things that I've not seen in a book before. And that included this strong historical context that runs through the book that helps us to and frames why things are as they are, as well as a very rounded consideration of some of the issues around teaching excellence. Topped off, as you said, Laura, with some very practical case studies, key takeaways and suggestions for practice, which I definitely have already highlighted a couple for myself to use. So thank you for this, a really great opportunity. So I've got a few questions for the panel. So I'm going to start off by considering the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework. It engendered a lot of controversy upon its introduction, and I wanted to ask the panel how they saw it. Do they see it as a force for good teaching or a constraint on learning and academic freedom? Who would like to go first?
I'll go first, if that's all right, Barry. And that's a cracking question, an incredibly difficult question to answer, because I think there's a whole degree of nuance that we need to look at here. I think we need to look at the wider aspects of further and higher education. And I go back to when I first started in further education. I taught my first class in 1993. And I remember when the A-level results came out that year, one particular teacher, their entire class had failed their A-levels. And of course, I looked at it, I thought, well, the head of department is not going to be happy at all. There's going to be major problems here. But the head of department's attitude was very much a shrug, and it's, yeah, that always happens. And of course, come September, a new group of, well, frankly, sacrificial lambs were brought into the classroom to go through the whole process again. So there was nothing much on student experience. Colleges were closed during the summer. And in actual fact, I think we need to look back pre the current era and not see it as some sort of golden age. I know Robin Simmons up at Huddersfield has done a lot of good work on this. And in actual fact, although there was good practice, it was very uneven. So frankly, anything that focuses on teaching and learning, for me, is a good thing. And I think we've seen with the TEF, but also the NSS, and maybe to a lesser extent the PTES, that there has been a focus on teaching and learning, on the student experience, and trying to improve things. Now, I think we have to nuance that. We have to contrast that with the fact that if we focus entirely on the metrics, on the end result, there is a problem. I know Linda Barkas up at Teesside has looked at the methodological issues of the TEF, and I think there's a danger that if you focus on simply the outcome, then the whole process is not going to be worthwhile. In the book, there's a case study from Paul Stone, who's director of HE at Middlesbrough College, and I love the case study because what he talks about is that the TEF is confirmation of what they do and the excellence in Middlesbrough College. It's not something that they worked massively towards. They just explained what they did, and that led to the TEF Gold. So I think for me, as I said at the start really, that anything that focuses on teaching and learning is a very positive move. We'll just have to be careful that we don't start almost treating it as a game, and we treat it as something that will raise the standard.
Yeah, sorry. I was just saying, a lot of what Peter said, I sort of support, and I had a very similar experience my first year teaching in FE, Peter, a little bit before yours, about 10 years before, where I actually managed to get 2 people to pass an A-level. And I was treated as this sort of demigod, as this new guy would come and actually managed to get 2 people to actually pass an A-level. So a very, very sort of similar experience, yes. But there is a sense whereby a lot of these metrics put there to drive behaviour. So as you said, the focus on teaching and learning from the TEF is very well received. And in fact, the driving force behind the TEF, of course, was Madeline Atkins, who was the VC at Coventry before she went off to do what she did. And even 15, 20 years ago, she was constantly talking about we must have something to balance against the ref. Something that raises teaching is the same sort of profile as the ref and research. And, you know, to get across the message that it is okay to focus on teaching and learning as your primary activity within the sector. And I think a lot of that was driven through. I mean, I think the bigger question for me is whether the actual measures in the TEF are the correct ones, because they do focus on outcomes. You're quite right, Peter. But I think in terms of raising the profile of teaching and learning, I mean, that was the original motivation behind it. And it does seem to have had that sort of effect to some extent. Whether teaching is still regarded as being, whether teaching is now regarded as being equal to research as a career development, I'm not convinced by that. But anything to raise the profile must be good.
Thank you. Leanne, do you have something to say?
Sorry, yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with what Paul and Peter had said. For me, it really is about, is it the driver? Because if you're playing the game where you're focusing on what the TEF measures, there's lots that you'll miss. That actually that should be the outcome of good practice that you have already established within the universities and within colleges. So for me, it shouldn't be a game that you should play. That the TEF group should follow because of the good practices that you already have established. So it shouldn't really be the driver. And echoing Paul's point there about what is actually measured, you know, we're constantly forced to demonstrate impact, and it's so hard to measure impact in terms of some metrics, particularly if one of your key drivers is about making a difference. So, you know, looking at graduate outcomes as an example, or good honours degrees, you know, sometimes you fail to look at the value that you've added or the learning gained along the way for particular groups of students. And then, you know, graduate outcomes doesn't take into account those students that might then go into the third sector or might set up their own business, or, you know, so I think, you know, it has a place, you know, to maintain that parity of esteem between teaching and research. It absolutely does. But I guess where I'm a little bit more sceptical is around, you know, using that as the driver, and that actually we miss some really, really important data. And hopefully within the book, you'll see some of the case studies are a really good example of that, of excellent initiatives that are happening across the sector that, you know, aren't driven by the TEF, but will have an impact on the TEF because of their activities and you know, the approach that they're taking. And I think that all boils down to the reason why we're here, really, and that is to make a difference in education and make a difference to students' lives and their you know, their overall aspirations.
Thank you. Thank you. A very nice, once again, well-rounded and considered response. And sort of raises the status of teaching and learning. It guides us into certain areas, but we shouldn't think of it simply as metrics, but as a support and encouragement for teaching excellence. I guess that brings us naturally into how teaching excellence can be supported. So in the book, you suggest that lesson observations have the potential to be quite controversial. I have to say that's true in my institution, that they are very controversial, because lecturers worry about, you know, their purpose and the process and how they're going to be used. So given the amount of research in this area, do you think there's still a place for observation in UK colleges and universities?
I think the short answer is yes. But I think, again, as with my previous answer, you've got to nuance this. And I think in many ways it's the same thing as with what we're trying to do with the book, that you need to reimagine observations, and we can't simply reduce observations to numbers. I think that's the way in which it's maybe been looked at in the past. And I think for me, that is a danger. Now, I don't know how many people are on this in this particular webinar, but I suspect if we ask everybody what you see as outstanding teaching, we'll probably get almost as many answers as we've got people. And so what we've got is, if we're trying to do any sort of measurement and any sort of judgment, we're backing a loser here, because actually we're only looking at a small percentage of what we see in terms of observation. So in effect, we're trying to measure the immeasurable. Now, I'm not going to rehash the work of Professor Matt O'Leary at Birmingham City University, but obviously he's done the seminal work when it comes to lesson observation. But what I will say is that for me, this comes down to the very heart of how we see teaching, whether we see teaching as an art, a science, or whether we see it as a craft. And I think in recent years, observation and teaching in general has been seen as a craft. In other words, the set of skills to be ticked off. If you tick off all of the skills, then you've got an outstanding teacher, you've got an outstanding lecture. And in actual fact, I think that's a very dangerous precedent to take. I remember watching a very good lesson many years ago in a college, and the teacher stopped what was an excellent starter activity after about 10 minutes. And at the end of the session, I said, "Why did you start it?" The students were engaged, it was flowing, it was a great start to the lesson. The lesson was a tremendous success. And they said that the college had a template that once you went over 10 minutes in terms of the starter, you were marked down, and that would mean that your overall grade was reduced. And the problem is that I think we should always keep excellence in our mind, but for me, teaching is more of an art. And it's not, my role as an observer is not to tell people what to do, but to guide and to allow them to come up with the answers themselves. Just because you like Edouard Manet as an artist doesn't mean that you can't appreciate Roy Lichtenstein. And I think it's the same with lesson observations. What you've got to do is find a way round things where you can develop, you can support people, but maybe move away from a more judgmental approach.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that, and I've always learnt a huge amount from observing others as well. It's been really helpful for my own practice, and sometimes quite different practices from my own teaching have been, very insightful. So I have a question now, and I know this is a difficult question, but you raised it in the book. So, that's why I feel that it's a legitimate one to put you on the spot, and one that is close to my heart. What do you do with that experienced colleague who is that exceptional academic and receives great student feedback, but takes a very perhaps traditional pedagogic approach and is resistant to change, perhaps not wanting to adopt new strategies? Have you got any advice for us there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and sometimes our lives really, and I think it is a really good point to raise. I mean, it's fascinating. I was listening again and watching again the late great Sir Ken Robinson's RSA lecture on changing paradigms, and I'm always completely inspired by it. Always interesting. It's thought-provoking. But in actual fact, it is, in many ways, when you strip it down, it is a lecture. It is a very traditional lecture. The difference, of course, is it's given by somebody who was immensely skilled and could engage an audience. And sadly, there is only one. There was only one Ken Robinson. And I think when we look at this, we need to think about things in a twofold manner. We have to look at the skill of the lecturer, but we also have to look at the expectations of the student. One of the factors that we look at in a lot of depth in the book is how the role of students has changed in especially the last 10 years. And I know some people tend to see students as customers. And personally, I don't like that at all. I think it suggests a homogeneity which doesn't exist. I mean, lectures, teaching is not like going to the local shop and buying a can of baked beans. You're, in many ways, getting an experience. And I think it's Mike Tomlinson talks about the student as a consumer, and that's probably closer to the truth. And we need to take into account the student expectations. Now, our member of staff might well be very skilled at what they do, in which case, that we're starting a very strong base. But I think it's vital to open everybody's eyes to alternative methods. I think there's a few case studies that really come to mind at this point. Emily Atkinson has done a fantastic piece of work about internationalisation and broadening students' perceptions. I think Ian Turner up in Derby has talked about pantomime lessons, which is great. Natalie Morris and Judith Darnell at Bedford College as well have contributed things which are designed to open the eyes of students, but also open the eyes of staff. And for me, the key thing is a dissemination of best practice in each organisation. If you can open people's eyes and make people think about teaching in a different way, then hopefully our skilled veteran lecturer will be able to introduce more variety into their lessons. And that's, I think, what we all try to push to do.
I think there's probably a link back here, Peter, to the previous question as well, because how do you open that lecturer's eyes? You do it through some sort of peer observation scheme. I mean, a lot of it's about professional development. You can't develop professionally in isolation, so you need that stimulus. It may be that this really good lecturer simply doesn't know what else he could do, and he may turn out to be equally good at that. I mean, just going back to the previous question as well. I mean, I think the question about peer observation, if there's any FE colleagues on call, I actually found it quite an odd question anyway, because that's what they do, that's how they develop, that's how they move things forward. So I think part of the question with very good lecture, but very traditional, is to do with observing and just opening his eyes to seeing other ways of doing things. And one of the themes that does come out through the book in various places is that idea of professional development, and continuous professional development is something which is key to actually trying to improve and achieve teaching excellence as well.
I think what's quite interesting here as well is this what we've seen happen over the last 6 months. And if you take, the standard theory, Costa's theory of change and creating a crisis, suddenly things can change that we never thought before were possible that could change. So, suddenly, we've had this opportunity now, and it's horrible to talk about the pandemic as an opportunity, but actually it is in some senses. Things that weren't possible before, like, our professional bodies saying it has to be exam. Suddenly it didn't have to be an exam. Lots of lecturers have had to, and in most cases have done a phenomenal job over the summer and, even at the beginning of the lockdown period, converting their materials to be made available online. Now, those traditional lecturers, have had to change because of that. And, the sorts of feedback that we're getting from our students now where I am, is this is better than what I thought it was going to be. This is better than what I expected. So that, sometimes a forced change can actually be a good change, can't it?
Absolutely. No, thank you. Okay. So another key theme that comes through the book is about employability. And I guess that's right in terms that the value of the university is often framed as in terms of student employability and perhaps in terms of student employment outcomes. In the book, you suggest that the term employability has become rather a generic catch-all, often used without much thought to what it actually means. What could course teams do to address this issue? What for you is employability, and what would course teams do to address the fact that it's been rather downgraded into a generic term?
Okay, I'll take that first. I think, that idea of employer is a catch-all. I mean, every institution will have some sort of employability strategy, some sort of employability statement. The problem with all sorts of statements at that sort of level is that employability is multifaceted. It means different things in different contexts, in different discipline settings. I mean, in the book, we use an example of a nursing student, whereby employability for a nursing student is actually quite specific, and their whole course is driven by the needs of that profession that they're going into. Because there are fundamentally two broad meanings for employability. There's employability in the sense of career development, career progression, that sort of the whole sort of developmental aspects of employability. But I think where the conflation comes is that is then conflated with a different sort of meaning of employability, if you like, which is about getting that first job on graduation or completion of your course. And in some areas, the two are not the same. Now, in nursing, they probably are, because the whole of a nursing degree or any sort of professional allied to medicines is about the competency to do that job. So the career development and getting the first job, the skills, the competence, the basics the same. If you think about a business or a humanities student, though, that's not true. I mean, to get that first graduate job, whether you're history or an account or business school, the skills to actually get over and get into the graduate labour market are quite different. You need to be able to cope with assessment centres, with all that rigmarole and all around getting over the threshold into the first job. But that is quite different than the sort of career development skills and employability skills which they were developed through the course, the critical thinking, the personal development. So I think there is this problem of conflation between those two sort of very broad meanings of employability. And I think course teams need to start from that basis. You know, what does it actually mean for students on degree X? I think the other very important thing about employability is it should not be bolt-on. It should be built into a course. And it should be the students who actually take control and drive their own personal development and employability. Now, if you look in the chapter in the book on this, there's two really good examples of this. The first case study is from Stephen Smith at Sussex, about a module on auditing. With apologies to any auditors on the call, it's not the most exciting of areas, although I'm sure auditors would disagree. But the way she engages students with that is by making it part of the process. The students can actually, the exercise they do with external employers, they can immediately see the benefit and the point of doing that. The other case study is actually much more ambitious, where a whole course team on a business management degree, Mary Crossan wrote the case study, although it's very much a course effort. The student is given some control over developing and assessing their own skills, what they need to develop, where do they want to go. So it's try and personalise, and it's a student who's driving their own personal and employment development. So I think that's quite important, that the students actually take responsibility. Bolt-on skills modules, there's lots of it, they don't work. Staff don't like them, students don't like them, they don't see the points, they have very little impact at the end of the day on what students actually do. So that's my sort of take on it.
Thank you. Yes, and a really important point that students need to drive this process. And we want to do more than just give students voice. We want to give students a real active, sort of part in leading their own learning. So I'm going to come back to the pandemic now. Sort of one of the things that so impressed me about the book, that you managed to link quite a few of the issues and themes to today's situation. How you managed to do that when, the book was very nearly being published, well, my hat is off to you. I thought that was great. So I'm thinking about teaching excellence in that context, and I take on board, Leanne, what you've already said, that, it provides an opportunity, but it's also been an incredibly busy time for academics. I'm personally quite exhausted over the last, sort of 3-4 months. So how do we encourage innovation in UK education, especially in light of, the pandemic, where the focus for many of us is elsewhere, just keeping on top of things.
No, I think you're right, and speaking to staff across the whole sector, people are really quite exhausted, and in some extent, you're doubling up the work that you have to do, because there's still a provision in lots of places to deliver some on-campus teaching, but at the same time, you have to prepare the same materials for those students that can't be on campus. So take a relatively stressful job anyway, and then put this into it, then it is making it really hard. I think the innovation piece is quite interesting, because innovation in itself, it's that word, if you ever use it in the setting, people just think, oh, that means more work. So if you want me to try something new, no, I haven't got time for that, I just need to keep doing what I'm doing. But actually, sometimes trialing different innovations can be better for you in terms of managing time. It can be quite liberating, especially if you look at where who owns that the innovation. We do need to hand over quite a lot more to our students. We talk about co-creation. There can be a lot of student-led activities here, which means that sort of burden on the creation and the delivery isn't just about the academic, and doing that empowers the students as well. I think the other thing is, I've already mentioned about the piece about exams, and how the pandemic has forced the change so that things are now possible. But there's lots of other things as well, that we've seen so much more variety in the types of online delivery that's been available, the different platforms that people are using. But then, things are happening that, I think, well, why didn't we do that before? Inviting guest lectures in remotely. Why was that not normal before? Why was that seen as being innovative? Whereas now that's just what we've got to do. We can't get hold of that guest lecturer because he's in Belfast that day. Well, there was no reason why we couldn't have ever arranged it this way. And the student collaboration as well, getting students together across the world. We've got international students at the moment that haven't made it here yet. They can still be part of that learning experience, and the whole sort of cross-cultural aspect can be built in through, international projects with partners, the collaborative online work that we see that happens now. So, innovation is still possible, and maybe a part of it is about sort of resetting expectations, or reprogramming people to think about what innovation actually means, and that it doesn't just mean we've got a lot more work to do now. We need to reframe it some way. But I guess my final point really on that question is that we absolutely cannot ignore the staff and student wellbeing piece about what's happening at the moment, and that there is a lot of pressure on academics, and there's a lot of pressure on students who are being forced to adapt to a very different way of doing things. So, I would urge anybody in education settings at the moment to just keep asking for the support and make sure that it's a mainstream provision, and that there's systems in place so that staff can look out for each other, so that we can see the warning signs of somebody who is showing the signs of stress. And that might be a lot of us at the moment. So I guess it's just a plea on my part, just to be kind, to be kind to each other, and to appreciate the very strange environment that we're in.
Yeah. That's an important point, isn't it? We know that there are things that will go wrong and that have gone wrong, and we need to be kind to each other when they do. You were talking about the effect of the pandemic on both staff and students. Do you think that students from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly in terms of their continued participation and the increased likelihood perhaps even of them dropping out, do you think that they are particularly vulnerable?
I think to some extent they are. It's quite interesting when you speak to students about their experiences now. That the students from disadvantaged backgrounds, there's lots of sort of intersectional issues then that can also occur. I'm hearing stories from some of the students here around digital poverty and having to share their devices with siblings and with family members. They're having to share their study space with other family members. I had a student the other day say to me, "Is there any chance at all I can borrow a laptop just for a few hours because I'm trying to write my assessment on my mobile phone?" I mean, that's just a horrible situation. I could never expect a student to achieve what their potential is with that sort of situation. So, of course, we've got lots of students that are carers and parents as well. But on the other hand, we have seen some students that have found it better, because they've had more flexibility to work. It's given them more flexibility in terms of caring responsibilities. So there's a balance between the two, but we have to recognise that and avoid situations where an example would be forcing students to turn their cameras on, their microphones on. That's not an inclusive way of doing things. Students may be really, really conscious of what's in their background and what their environment is, and not every platform lets you blur it out or put, fancy backgrounds to it. So you do just have to be careful. But I think we talk about it a bit in the book around avoiding the deficit model as well. So the burden in these sorts of situations shouldn't be on what we can do to get the student to change. It should be what should we be doing to change, to make the environment better for the student. And there's lots of things that we can actually do here. So, we need to be mindful of when we're asking students to engage with synchronous activities. Does it fall within school time? We know that lots of aftercare things have broken down over the pandemic. We know that we've got international students who, the 9 o'clock in the morning for us is really not the best time for them. So having an element of choice there as well. And also in assessment design, if we say, right, we're going to put the exam online, you've got 2 hours to do it between this point and this point, what if another sibling in the family needs the kit at that particular point of time? So making sure that the flexibility is there. And actually just having a bit of trust in our students. Sometimes I hear some worrying comments that, students aren't turning the cameras on. Maybe they're lying in bed watching it. Who cares? Who cares if that's how they want to engage in it? Really, they're engaging, and that's what matters. So I think, the overall piece is around just recognising how difficult this will be for all students, but there will be groups of students that find it a lot harder than others do because of their home environment or their personal circumstances.
If I could just add something to that, if that's all right, and I think it's very easy to criticise the government, so I'm probably going to just criticise the government at this point. But I think what tends to frustrate as well is that there's an assumption with all of the rules, the regulations, and everything that comes up, that students are very much the traditional going away from home, living in halls, and maybe are sort of like not, are very sort of skilled at what they do in terms of the digital skills. And I think that's just simply not the case. And it's very frustrating as well that a lot of students do seem to be forgotten, as Leanne said. A lot of our students are international students, and so the idea of having a corridor for students to return home, a 6-day corridor for students to return home, for example, is nonsensical. We have a vast number of commuting students at John Moore, so for them, sort of, return home means maybe crossing the Mersey, and that's about it. So looking at it, I think what we've got to take into account is it's very difficult to just pigeonhole students into various groups. And yes, students from disadvantaged backgrounds have been penalised in many ways, but I think it's important that we look at students as a whole and look at them not as a homogenous group, but look at them as individuals and try to deal with them as individuals, something which is very difficult when we're being told what to do.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm conscious of the time, Laura. Have I got time for one more question, or would you like to open it up to the audience at this point?
I think one more question will be fine. Yes, thanks, Barry.
All right. Thank you so much. I have been researching into assessment and feedback for the last 20 years, and and it's still problematic. I would like to end on an assessment and feedback question, if that's okay with you. So, thinking about feedback, and given that research suggests that the majority of students fail to engage with their feedback, how would you suggest that we ensure that students from all backgrounds understand the benefits and that feedback and indeed feed forward can bring to their learning? Who wants to take that one?
I'll kick off, I think, Darren. I know you've done a lot of work around this, so I'm slightly in awe of what I'm going to say, or trepid as to what I'm going to say, and you're sat at either end there. I think really, fundamentally, it comes back to what exactly do we mean by feedback? What's it for? What's its purpose? And I think that there's still a wide mindset that basically feedback comes at the end and it's the way the student gets the mark. And that's it. It's a product. I think Peter wrote a chapter in the book, and he talks about it as a production line, as opposed to a painting, which is an art. And the idea that feed forward should actually be part of the learning process, in the same way that assessment should be part of the learning process. So the two go hand in hand, but they need to be designed in as part of the learning to get students to engage with the whole process. Similar to the discussion we had about employability and one or two other areas, it's about students getting engaged and feedback being part of the process. So it's part of the curriculum. And there's been a lot of, as you said, there a lot of research done recently. One book I would reference book came after we'd actually written it was the latest Winstone and Carlos book.
Fantastic book.
Which is a really good, and it makes this point about assessment and feedback being a process. It's a transformational process. But I think the big block on all of that is convincing our colleagues that it is not just about the mark at the end. It is part of the learning process. I'm sure actually Peter and Leanne nodding away in the background, but it's actually quite difficult to change that culture around feedback. Yeah.
There is a culture, isn't there, on what we write in terms of feedback. It's the mode of delivery, the quantity, the actual content, rather than what is done with the feedback once the students have received it in whatever way that they've received it. Leanne, it looked like you wanted to add something. Did I cut you off?
No. I mean, I was looking a little bit more at the assessment piece and about how we drive the feedback to, so that it's for learning. And that's obviously that sort of terminology is one that we've been trying to embed for a long time now. But, it feels like we need to do something a bit more radical, maybe, to sort of change the minds of people around feedback and around assessment. I mean, some of you will have seen earlier this week the tweet that came out from the Department of Education. So I'm going to read it because I know it'll annoy everybody. So there's a widespread consensus that exams are the best and fairest way of judging a student's performance. Now, when I saw that tweet, I'm not actually going to tell you what I said because, it's probably not appropriate for here. But I mean, that sort of rhetoric really confirms and reinforces traditional. And that's exactly what we're not trying to do now. We're trying to bring more innovation in. We're trying to, I'd love to know where this widespread consensus has come from, because for how long have we been talking about this in the sector now? Authentic assessment, the choice in assessment, flexibility, embedding feedback as part of the assessment and learning process. I do feel like, we perhaps need to try and be more forceful about how radical, the radical changes that we need.
And the things we know. And what research has shown over and over again to be the things we know and the things that work. Thank you very much for that. Unless anybody has a burning point that they want to finish up with, I'm going to hand it over to Laura and the audience. No? Okay, Laura, over to you.
Thanks. I was on mute, but it's an hour will never be enough to talk through all of this. There's so much to discuss here, but we do have 15 more minutes. So please ask questions, put them in the Q&A box. We do have one already, and that's that COVID-19 has forced institutions to rapidly review and amend their approaches to TLA with a widespread move to more blended or even fully online approaches. Is there a way back to old methods, or, as has been said, is the toothpaste out of the tube? Who wants to tackle that one?
I mean, I don't think we should ever go back. So, yeah, no, I don't think we should ever go back. I mean, we let's go back and pick the bits that worked really, really well, and then let's just leave the things that didn't work very well and replace them with these new skills that we've developed over the time. I mean, I do get frustrated when people say, you know, when it gets back to normal, you know, that worries me a little bit, because I think, you know, normal wasn't great. You know, that we've learned a lot over the last 6 months in terms of new ways of doing things. And I guess the missing piece here for me that often happens is around the student voice. You know, trying to hear what are the students telling us about their experiences now. And we often anticipate that. But you know, when you actually speak to them, they often tell us a very different story. So I think, again, a sort of plea really to make sure that the students are brought in as part of the decision making in terms of what the new normal might look like, or what, you know, what's the next 5 years in education going to look like. It has to be the students that tell us that.
And there is a sense that the pandemic has certainly hastened change that was already underway. I mean, in the book we reference back to the Policy Institute paper at the avalanche is coming about 10 years ago. Which it never did. Little bits appeared, but it didn't sweep everything away as it was meant to. But it could well be that the COVID has actually hastened all of that. And, you know, as Laura said, that the phrase I've heard in various places, that the toothpaste is out of the tube and we can't put it back. And I think there might be sense that we shouldn't put it back. So I don't know. That's my take on it anyway.
I think that's absolutely it. I totally agree with both Leanne and Paul about this. And I think what it's created is a far more fluid and a fluid sector, and that's in many ways really exciting. You know, I think back before the pandemic, and validations tend to be a case of updating reading lists and just altering the topics, altering the order of the topics. Now validation is the opportunity to do all sorts of different things. And I think for me, the whole culture of further and higher education has changed, and people are looking to be more innovative. I loved Berry's question about our old expert who was very skilled at what they did, but did it in their own particular way. And my feeling is that person is becoming a dying breed. And although it's only, oh gosh, what will it be, about 7-8 months we've been in this situation, the changes that have happened in those 7 and 8 months are greater than we've seen in the last 2 decades.
Excellent. Yes, I completely agree. We have a question from the chat box. Keen to hear more on student expectations and the potential mismatch of what we as academics think students want, but the student expectations are different, especially given the context of the student voice being heard, but without the fear of impact on their experience and grades. It's a difficult tension to get right.
Yeah.
Go on.
You go, Peter.
No, I was going to say, I think it's a cracking question. It is very difficult. I think in many ways it's about working with students as partners. And I think it was something I referenced earlier on, that we started off this sort of new era looking at it and being very worried by the officers for students who talked about value for money and actually referenced students as customers. And that, for me, is a mistake. Students are not customers. They're far more important in many ways than just customers. We need to work with them and organise expectations. In my experience, it's very rare to find students who are unreasonable when told about the situation. And if you involve students in the design at all levels of the university and college life, you get their input. And in fact, what happens then is you come up with something which is often better than if you'd have just done it via lecturers. But it's about being realistic as well. There will be some things that you're not able to do, but by including students at every level of the design, implementation and evaluation, you can make that clear and make sure that expectations are realistic and that the end result is of a high quality.
That kind of segues well into the next question, which is about online learning tips. What are the things that you would say work well with online learning that you weren't aware of before COVID? And are there any particular software or ways of presenting that you would recommend?
I can share some examples of things that I've found to have really polar views on, and that's the breakout rooms. So there was a really interesting article in the Tab a couple of weeks ago about this, and there seems to be there's a need for some research and some development work about how breakout rooms are used with students, because the tendency is, right, click the button, students are in breakout rooms, come back in 5 minutes. They all turn the cameras and the mics off and disappear for 5 minutes and then come back. And the feedback that we've just been gathering over the last couple of weeks has showed that, we need to do something about that. We need to do a bit of development work to try and understand how best to engage the students in it. And I think in terms of how things have gone well, how well the students have engaged with the different methods that we're using, I think has been really, really interesting, and how quick they were to also make that shift. I think that was, I think that's been really, really valuable, and we actually shared with our students the details of the training that we'd been doing over the summer as academics to try and prepare ourselves for, giving them a great experience. So we try to be quite transparent with them, and to say, look, this is what we're trying to do, but it is being honest with them and saying there's things that we won't get right yet because this is new to all of us, and we just want you to tell us. Maybe Peter and Paul have got some other examples of things that have worked well. I don't know whether I really answered that part properly.
I think it's interesting, and it's great that you mentioned breakout rooms as well, because that's something that I've been looking at, and also my colleagues have been looking at, and we've had the same experience. And what students tend to say is that they don't necessarily like being herded into a room and told get on with it. And in actual fact, what we've tried to do, and I know a lot of people who've contributed to case studies have done this, is they've tried to give the students that sort of ownership. And so the lecture in some ways is a facilitator. And rather than saying you five, you're in this breakout room, it's more a case of you've got a task. This is what you need to produce, and then they come up with the solution. I was talking to some of our students last night actually about this, and they've got so many support networks and so many social media networks. In actual fact, especially if they're motivated, if you give them a task, they'll go away and organise things themselves and come back. It's when they're told what to do that they don't like it. So, I think the whole breakout room discussion is fascinating, but I'm well aware that we've only got a few minutes left.
Well, a kind of link from that one is an interesting question about whether online learning in schools, the prevalence of that will mean that there's a change with how students come prepared to learn when they arrive at university.
I actually think that's been an issue before this, that students' experience in schools and colleges is actually quite different than what they get at university. And for whether that's a good or a bad thing, I would like to say. The one thing that always strikes me is whiteboards. because for some students will never actually see somebody stand in front with a pen and write on a whiteboard until they go to university, because it's interactive, but all the stuff they have in colleges and schools. So it is almost a step back. But then there's a sense, when I've spoken to colleagues about this in the past, there's a sense that that's what students expect university to be like. So it is difficult. It's always been an issue, and it may well be that it becomes more of an issue in the future. I don't know. I really don't know. And again, it's that diversity of students, because the experience of a student from China before they come to university is going to be quite different again than a student who comes from the UK or comes from Europe. So it's diversity is an issue we need to keep at our forefront of our minds all the time, actually. And in relation to the previous question as well, actually. Different students will take to different things online as they do face-to-face teaching.
And I think we have a role to play in making sure that we have got access. We're giving students access to the training, the support to help develop their skills around these sorts of things. I mean, I've seen some really excellent resources by some universities that are helping prepare the students for what to expect with an online lecture, or personal productivity workshops and writing skills workshops and managing your time. And, I just think that we really, really need to signpost to those resources as much as we can, and try to encourage the students to engage with them, because that's something that we would never have had to have done as much as before. Maybe we've signposted them to the library, somewhere to get some academic writing support, but actually there's the skill set required for learning online or learning in a blended approach is really quite different, and not necessarily anything like what they've experienced at school before.
Yes, it is actually Academic Writing Month, so it's an apt time to mention that. And again, as a brief shameless plug, Open University Press does have many study skills books which looks at these topics, not obviously in the context of the pandemic, but will still be relevant. Someone asked, how do you assess the quality of learning for online classes? This is probably our last question. How realistic are the results the students get through their online submissions?
That's a really difficult question to finish on. But yeah, I think there's two parts to this. And the first part is, how do we assess the quality of what of online learning? That is incredibly difficult to do. And I think I'd like to link that to the last two questions, actually. But I would argue that the recent months have seen the education sector, in many ways, at its best. There's been some incredible stories. And my only concern I've always had is that people have been trying to say, this is how to teach online. This is the way in which students want us to teach online. In many ways, it's falling into the same trap as maybe we started talking about, that actually, if you have a tick box, yes, that's a top online lesson. Of course, it's not, because our students are so different. So I think, although I can't necessarily tell you the answer to how do we make sure everything is of really good quality, I can say that one of the things we need to avoid is trying to be too prescriptive and trying to come up with a template for teaching online. And I would have another shameless plug for making sure that observations take place and that we create a community where people are learning from each other. The second part of the question is, I think that the hint was, how do we make sure that students are engaging and are actually doing things themselves and making sure that they do things to the best of their ability. And that's where the design, the assessment comes in is so important. The use of authentic assessments is still underdeveloped, I would argue, in the further and higher education sector. And it's something that we need to work on. We need to move away from 3,000-word essay for every single piece. And I'm sorry, at the risk of riling Professor Sally Brown again, the problems of, the consensus that an exam is always the best way of testing things. And we need to move away to things which are very difficult to actually sort use other people to provide the assessment, but also things which engage our students. And if we do that, I think we solve the problem anyway.
Yes, and it kind of comes back to Leanne's point of the pandemic, the silver lining on the pandemic, that this is the time for us to be able to reassess what works best, how to engage students, and how lecturers and instructors can keep changing their methods to make sure that they're engaging as well. So that is, of course, about all we have time for, folks. Thank you so much for what was a very, very engaging discussion, and I know that if we had more time, we could have covered a lot more topics. I'm hoping that this may be the first of a few webinars which look at teaching and learning and how to achieve excellence. But there is so much in the book, of course, as well as the wider discussion that is happening all around us at the moment. So thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you, Barry, for chairing and for those really excellent questions, hard-hitting questions. Thank you to the audience, especially for that tricky one at the end, to leave on a challenging note. I think we've all had to think and scratch our heads about what the future holds. And as a reminder, of course, with the discount Open Up 20, you can get a 20% discount from our McGraw Hill website for the book Achieving Teaching Excellence, which is out now. Congratulations, Peter, Leanne, and Paul, on what is a fantastic book.
Thank you very much, and thank you for OUP's support, and to all of our case study writers, and of course to Barry as well for chairing.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again soon, and we have recorded the event, so for anyone who has missed it, they will be able to catch it again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.